Hello, Croeso. Welcome to the Senedd Sources podcast, where we take you inside Welsh politics. I am Ollie Cole, and also with me on the podcast, Joe Kiernan, former advisor to First Ministers Rhodri Morgan and Carwyn Jones. Before that, a journalist, and now at Cavendish Consulting. Hello, Joe.
Hello there.
Lovely to have you with us. And Craig Lawton, who is a political advisor and candidate for the Welsh Conservatives, now working at Grasshopper Communications. Hello, Craig, and are you feeling better?
Morning, Ollie. I am. Thank you very much.
Good to hear.
I just for reference. So this is not a reference to Reen, but I actually don't remember last week's show. It's definitely not a reflection of Reen, to be clear. But yeah, I clearly was so unwell. I don't remember it happening. So I'll watch it back and
enjoy it for struggling on.
Yes. Thankfully, if you, like Craig, haven't heard last week's show, you can listen back to it whenever and wherever you like. On the podcast today, can the Greens grab votes? A Reform MS faces suspension, and doesn't Downing Street know there's an election on? Now, we have a WhatsApp number along the way. Any thoughts, comments, questions you've got, it's great for sending them in as you're listening, and we'll read them out in the next episode. We'll also use it when you come and join us for our live recordings in the future. That number you need, 0333 404 6507, and you can start your message with the word Senedd, or you can email us with your questions and comments as well. The email address is hello@senedsources.com, and you don't need to get a pen or paper. It'll all be in the show notes on whatever screen you are taking in this podcast from. Right, Craig, Joe, let's start with the Green Party, because they have had a Welsh Party conference just recently, and they are making some interesting moves in terms of Wales. Zach Polanski has been pretty vocal when it comes to the race for the Senedd. But Craig, what is the sort of realistic chance that they can really make some ground in May here in Wales?
Well, I mean, they're saying all the right things. They are talking about the fact that apparently in recent months their membership has gone up threefold, which I think is interesting. In addition to that, obviously they have a new leader in the UK, Zach Polanski. But then in comparison, actually, quite a bit of consistency from a Welsh perspective, with Anthony Slaughter remaining as leader for some considerable time. All that's putting them in a position where the polls are saying they are going to definitely, essentially, win one seat in the Senedd in next year's election, most likely in the Cardiff constituency. But then they're targeting up to three, which I think is interesting, because it's putting them in a position where they actually might have a little bit of influence going forward, and it gives them something to shoot for. And if we look back at some of the comparisons we've made recently, we talked about how Reform were maybe over-egging themselves and talking themselves up too much. Well, the Greens are talking themselves up a little bit, but they're not getting ahead of themselves. They're being quite realistic. And I think the fact that their conference was in Cardiff last weekend is the right place for them. It demonstrates where their support base is, where they've made gains in the past from a council level, and where they're looking to go target in the future as well, I think.
And Joe, the other interesting thing about the Green Party, and particularly in terms of Anthony Slaughter, is if Anthony Slaughter were to win that seat, Zach Polanski has indicated that, you know, the two parties, the Green Party of England and Wales, would potentially split.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's interesting because Zach has sort of leaped onto the stage, hasn't he? Hugely charismatic, hugely buoyant. The party's doing well in attracting members. I've seen figures on a sort of a UK basis. I haven't seen set figures for Wales to know just how the membership is bounding here, because a lot of this discussion around the Greens is framed in terms of the UK. And obviously, I think they're going to do extraordinarily well in some of the local elections in England next year, because they're seen as the progressive alternative to Labour and the dissatisfaction that we're seeing directed towards the Labour government. But here in Wales, of course, we have Plaid Cymru. And so I think they're right not to talk their chances up too much. The polling has them winning one seat, as Craig said. Theoretically, there's a chance they could pick up the sixth seat in a couple of places on our new voting system. But frankly, I think they're going to be lucky for that to happen. So that said, Anthony Slaughter could be in an interesting position next May if Plaid Cymru are the biggest party and he needs to, Pure needs to do deals with other people. But I'm intrigued that the notion of one elected member in Wales would see that split happening.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because if you any gain for the Greens, any victory in the Senedd is surely massive for them. It would be the first time there's ever been a member of the Senedd from the Green Party. And so even one would be a big story for them and something for them to focus on going forward. I guess it's like, how do you measure success? Is it one, or is it actually beating the Lib Dems? Could it be they get 2 and the Lib Dems get 1 and they consider that to be a victory, or 3-2? Weirdly, 3 Greens and 1 Lib Dem, or 2 of each, is an interesting couple of MSs when it comes to maybe pushing a few things through and doing a few deals as well.
I think it's going to be fascinating. And you've got to remember that in the past, Plaid Cymru and the Greens have worked very, very closely together. I think Cynog Davis, who was an early AM, as they were then for Ceredigion, who stood on both the Plaid Cymru and Green banner, I think, if my memory is serving me well. There have been sort of deals in local elections to ensure that they're not competing against each other. One suspects that Plaid Cymru won't be terribly keen to have any of those informal mechanisms in place going into Senedd 26.
And the interesting thing, Craig, is a sort of the Greens have a pretty easy job in England, in particular, in terms of defining themselves. They are essentially, if you are a disaffected Labour voter, if you are someone who is on the progressive wing of the Labour Party and you're not very happy with Keir Starmer, you go there. The difficulty for the Greens in Wales is defining yourself against the other parties, where actually, okay, Zach Polanski, you come out fighting on Welsh independence. Well, there's a high possibility that, like we said last week, Rhys Pure walks in and as First Minister already. So there's a range of options where actually you vote elsewhere, you don't vote Green. And as we discussed in our energy episode a while back, climate and Green Party policy is a very big thing to the people who care about it, but it's quite a low salience issue when you actually get to the ballot box.
Yeah, and that sort of notion of choice and variety of choice, I think, has already played out to an extent, because the Greens last weekend announced 2 what they would consider big defections to them from Labour. They're not directly from Labour, though, I would add. So they've taken the former leader of Labour Carmarthenshire Council Group, who used to be a councillor in Neathport Talbot as well at one point. But again, he had fallen out with the Labour Party some time ago, as far as I understand. And then also we've seen the recent Labour leader of Caerphilly Council, who left the party over the selection process in Caerphilly for Labour's candidate. He has now joined the Green Party. But that's where I think it's interesting, because only a few weeks ago, after he left Labour, he said publicly that he was backing Plaid Cymru to win that seat. So actually, we've seen someone leave Labour, back Plaid Cymru in a by-election, and then join the Greens, all in the space of a month. And I think that actually epitomises exactly where the Greens sit at the moment.
And Joe, you've got this idea, like you were saying, about measuring success for the Greens, where actually Zach Polanski is a very new leader. And actually, if he can bag a sort of what would be 100% success rate, upon what they've got already in Wales, that would put sort of rocket boosters under Zach Polanski, wouldn't it? It would show, at least to his own party, that they've picked the right man and he can do something.
Oh, undoubtedly. And as you've both said, any representation, even one, and if they're lucky 2, means that they've got a platform. And I think that it's the same as Reform, isn't it? It's getting a foothold. I know it's different for Reform. There's this prospect of potentially being the largest party. But I also think in terms of their policies, what we heard at the Welsh conference at the weekend, they were really trying to find a ground. I mean, they had a go at Labour, they had a go at Reform, they had a go at Plaid, and interestingly, they are sort of ploughing a furrow which they think is going to attract those disaffected people on the left. So your wealth taxes, your changes to welfare, rent controls, new council homes, green energy, all of that. So I think that if they can have even if it's limited success next May, it's a really good platform for going forward.
I think the big thing for the Greens, though, as well, is not just picking up disaffected Labour voters. It's similar to Reform in a way. It's picking up people that are disaffected with politics and don't vote. There are huge swathes of people out there who don't bother voting and aren't interested in voting and see no value in voting, but are certainly not going to be voting for Reform. And maybe a few of those voted Plaid a few weeks ago in Caerphilly, but maybe across the UK, that's what the Greens are going to be looking to. It's interesting because I'm not going to out any of them, but I've got a few friends on Facebook who are not into politics at all. They just don't do politics. And suddenly they've started sharing things from Zach Polanski. And I'm like, this is interesting that you're someone that's not political at all. And suddenly something has happened, something has energized them, and they want to be involved. And some of them have actually joined, which I think is a huge step. And don't get me wrong, that's not representative of the country by any means, but it's an interesting straw poll, I think.
But also, just to come in on that, I just think we haven't quite grasped either, or a lot of people haven't grasped the changes to the voting system, the fact that we are going to be in permanent coalition or minority government, most likely coalitions or at least some kind of agreement. So one person, two people, three people can have quite an impact on the policy programme of the next government, because we're not going to see any one party have enough to govern alone. Rhna Piodworth, I suspect, will try a minority government. I don't think it'll be stable enough for a 4-year period. So the prospect that one or two members could get some of their manifesto into the programme of government is a fairly big prize too, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a good example, isn't it, that actually we see some of the budget discussions that are happening right now in the Welsh Parliament. And who would have thought it? Russell George, former Conservative MS, now sitting as an independent in Montgomeryshire, is having discussions with the government about cross-border healthcare and funding, which it was surprising, I'll be honest with you, when it popped up on my my social media. Fair play to him. There's an argument that actually as an independent, he may well achieve more from a health funding perspective than he did as all of his time as a Conservative, I'm afraid to say.
And with Jane Dodds, there's your numbers.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
So how much do you worry about it, Joe? If you're like, I think in UK Labour, there is a sort of concern that you don't know which way to point because you're being sort of outflanked by both Reform and the Greens. If you're Labour in Cardiff Bay and you are looking to May, do you sort of bother giving Zach Polanski the time of day, or do you just think, it's mostly an England phenomenon, there is a bigger fight to be had, let's focus on that?
There's undoubtedly bigger threats, but that's not to say you should ignore them totally. And if the polls weren't the way they were, then I have no doubt if Labour were on course to be the biggest party after May, they would quite happily do deals with the Greens, with Plaid Cymru or whatever. So I think there's an understanding that parties are going to work together. But in terms of your election strategy for next May, you've got to be finding ways of dealing with the threats from both Plaid Cymru and Reform. And as I've banged on about ad nauseum in previous pods, I think you need to decide the road you're going to go down and stick to it rather than trying to be all things to all people. It ain't been working so far.
Well, let's turn to the other side of that equation then. Let's turn to Reform, because Reform's only Senedd member is facing a 2-week suspension. It's over some comments made in a WhatsApp chat back in August 2023. This is Laura Ann Jones, used to be a Conservative member of the Senedd. And Craig, I find this interesting because as we've seen both in local government in England and here in Wales, as sort of Reform grows and attempts to professionalise and attempts to get closer to election times, whether it's the by-election in Caerphilly, whether it's power in local government, whether it's having Laura Ann Jones in the Senedd, we're seeing the difficulty play out in real time of creating a new party and keeping it together and making sure everyone is sort of singing from the same hymn sheet and being upfront, honest and sort of holding themselves up to the public.
Yeah, and I don't know what discussions happen behind closed doors from a defection perspective. Honestly, I can tell you I've never been near any discussions on any side of those kind of points. But I guess there must be, from a party perspective, some level of haste wanting to get new people to join, to demonstrate momentum. And I guess those checks and balances just aren't being made. It's an interesting one, though, because from a Laura Ann Jones perspective, this should well have been something that Reform were aware of. They didn't really need Laura to declare anything to them. It was something that was already public knowledge. And so on that basis, we can only presume that Reform either didn't think it was going to be an issue or thought they could carry on irrespective either way. So yeah, it's an interesting one.
All of this was in the public domain months and months ago, months before she defected. There was a police investigation, for goodness sake. It was all over the media at one stage. So I just think that part of me thinks they just don't care. They think they can ride through these things, and actually that many of the people who support them won't actually think she's done terribly wrong. I saw Nigel Farage saying, 10 years ago, these racial slurs were common currency. Actually, I don't think they were. But if that makes
He
you
also
feel
tried
better...
to suggest to the journalists that they may have used that kind of language, which I thought was genuinely a weird thing to say to a journalist. It's kind of breaking that fourth wall. I thought it was really strange.
Yeah, and I just, it as I say, I just don't think this kind of thing worries the membership enough.
It brings in a couple of things here, which are one, Reform as an anti-establishment vote. And what Joe is talking about there is, okay, do people necessarily care about the individual politicians, or do they care about more so sending the message to Cardiff Bay that something needs to change, and I am using my vote as a protest, and this is, the way I'm doing it. And also the issue of standards in Cardiff Bay at the Senedd, which has sort of reared its head over and over again. Craig, is 2-week suspension has been recommended for this. Now, you could say it was 2 years ago, and so, it seems weird to sort of go harder than that. But do you think that's, one, enough of a punishment? And two, do you think it will actually bother any voter who's already thinking about reform?
I think taking the second one first, as Joe has touched on, I think for the majority of people that are interested in supporting reform and supporting the narrative that's coming out from them recently, either they won't care or it won't even register because it's not kind of on the algorithms, if you will, that they're paying attention to. Is it enough? I mean, it comes back down to the question of what power does the Senedd actually have at this stage? And also, I guess, what will the public think of this? I always think a 2-week suspension, the public would look at this and go, in any normal job, if you were to do something like this, you wouldn't be asked to not come into work for 2 weeks. And you wouldn't be told, you're not going to get paid for 2 weeks. So again, it's kind of like, what power does the Senedd have? And does it actually reflect what people expect of it as well?
Yeah, it's just not fit for purpose. And I don't know how many times people like me have to keep banging on about the fact that we've got to get this right. We've seen lots of occasions where we've had 1 week suspension, 2 week suspensions. It's neither here nor there. And there were a couple of things. This investigation took far too long. It took 18 months. That shouldn't happen. And any HR company, any HR department in a private company wouldn't be allowed to get away with that. But interestingly, the Standards Committee, after they had the report from the Commissioner, Douglas Bain, picked up a few things that I just wanted to talk about too. So one is neurodivergence. One of the witnesses and complainants, there were complaints about the way they were treated and the Commissioner's approach to neurodiversity. I mean, this shouldn't be happening in 2025. It was prompted after the Commissioner said, and I quote, he was not impressed by the demeanour of the complainant. Now, the committee are sufficiently concerned that they've raised these issues with the Commissioner, and I hope that new standards on that will be brought in the future. Secondly, there's an issue which I'm not sure people are fully aware of, and that's the use of NDAs, or as the Senedd likes to call them, settlement agreements. And it's been reported that other members of staff who'd worked for Laura Ann Jones believed there was poor behaviour, let's put it that way, but couldn't give evidence to substantiate lots of this complaint because they'd signed NDAs themselves, which stopped them from speaking out. Now, frankly, this is taxpayers' money. It's yours. It's my money that is paying for our elected members and their staff, and it's paying for elected members to effectively gag their staff. And there was an FOI in January 2022, so almost 3 years ago now. We don't have more up-to-date figures. But between 2013 and 2022, 14 support staff had entered into NDAs, and over £125,000 had been paid out to gag them from talking out about bad behaviour. I think it's shocking, and shame on the Senedd Commission, I think, for facilitating this. Hannah Blythin has done a lot on the recall petitions. I really hope that as chair of the committee, she is now going to look at this in the future, ban them, uphold proper standards so that elected members have to behave themselves or face the consequences. Public money should not be used to keep people quiet and prevent them from having the right to make complaints. Sorry, rant over.
No, absolutely. Craig, it is an interesting one. You know, you can understand it to a point where you go, okay, well, it's a sort of personnel management point and there's a place to go, and certain, you know, and a lot of people work in companies where you're expected not to, you know, say things about your own company to other people or things like that. But it's where that line is crossed that Joe picks up on, where one, it is taxpayers' money, and two, it is being used not just to sort of ensure sort of party discipline or messaging. It's being used to actually ensure that the public can't get to the bottom of wrongdoing.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, if you wanted to apply some kind of test to it in terms of judgment, it would be, is this what the public would expect, and how would the public respond? As you've said, it might feel like it's no different from a private legal matter within a corporation, and arguably from a legal perspective and an HR perspective, it is not. But there has to be somebody at the end of the day that looks at this and goes, how are we being perceived? And arguably, is this whole process bringing the Senedd into disrepute? And how is it impacting on how people hold us in their view as well? It's no different from, we could have a whole discussion about this. It's no different, arguably, from banks that were in public ownership and their leaders getting huge payouts, and people who lead quasi-public bodies getting significant bonuses. Yes, from an HR and a legal perspective, you might be entitled to that. But again, it's public money. How is it perceived? It has to be dealt with and looked at in a slightly different way. Whether you want to or not, whether you accept it or not, you're a politician and you are not in the same position as someone running a private business.
That's exactly it. You know, we have to expect, if we can't expect the highest possible standards, and I don't care if people do something wrong and then have the guts to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong, let's move on, depending on the severity. I think it's the notion that our elected members feel they can behave badly and sweep it all under the carpet. And it also breeds a culture where people are just too scared to speak out. And I just think that's wrong.
I think it's also just fair to acknowledge that while we're saying all of this, genuinely from my experience, the majority of politicians that I have dealt with, worked across from, have been perfectly reasonable, and I've had no issue with whatsoever. I think that's fair to say. I think, again, this kind of comes across from the fact that one or two people doing something which is questionable or using questionable practices means that everybody in some instances will presume is doing it, and it's very much not the case. We obviously don't know how many of those NDAs were applied by the same employer, the same MS in some cases. We don't know that as far as I'm aware. But, 60 MSs, reasonable turnover every 4-5 years. There have been a good number of MSs already, and as far as I'm aware, the majority of them have acted perfectly reasonably and acceptably during this entire time.
Accept that entirely. Yeah. My problem is that someone can continue behaving badly and running through staff at an astonishing rate, and there's no comeback to them. I don't think that the public elect people to act on their behalf to be behaving in this way.
there are two things that are going to change that could sort of alter this slight culture in the coming months. One is that the Ministry of Justice is currently bringing in a new reform that sort of people who sign NDAs won't be gagged from speaking out. So essentially, they'll have protection under the law if they've been a victim of crime or they've witnessed a crime. They can share their experiences with anyone, family, friends, employers, journalists, without fear of legal repercussions. So I think quite a big change in terms of how NDAs are going to be able to be used there. But also, Craig, a big change in sort of how discipline in the Senedd is run is on the horizon.
Yeah, so the Welsh government is currently bringing through legislation to enact a recall process. I spent my early hours of this morning looking back through the Senedd Standards Committee's recent inquiry into this matter, and they took evidence from some different models on what could be used and what could be put in place. And ultimately, I think you've got to bear in mind that when this system is brought into place, assuming it does come into place, there'll be two ways in which a recall can be triggered. One is if somebody is convicted of a criminal act, and the second one is if they receive as far as I'm aware, like a reprimand of high enough significance from the Senedd. All we're doing, I would argue, there is moving the goalposts, because then what we have to now discuss is what's considered significant enough, and actually ignoring Laura Ann Jones's actions, let's just look at the sanction that's been put in place. As far as I'm aware, a 2-week suspension from the Senedd would not be enough to trigger a recall petition. And so all we're doing is moving the goalposts here, I would argue.
Now, lots more to come here on Senedd Sources. If you thought Joe's rant earlier was a lot, get ready for what's coming. We are going to be asking you guys, as we discuss May's elections consistently here on this podcast, we ask the question, does Downing Street even know there's an election on? Remember to subscribe on your podcast app, or you can watch us on YouTube. Of course, you can just search for Senedd Sources, where we upload full episodes for you to enjoy. And you can WhatsApp us as you're listening with questions, comments, ideally use a voice note so we can play it out on next week's episode and listen to you as well. The number you need, 0333 404 6507, and start your message with the word Senedd. We will be right back. This is the Senedd Sources podcast. Thanks for being with us today. I'm Ollie, with us is Joe and Craig as ever. And this is a remarkable story of the week, really, politically. I'm going to turn to you first, Joe, because the amount of infighting, briefing in Labour coming out of Downing Street, those around Keir Starmer, aides of the Prime Minister, has been astonishing, and particularly when you put it in the context of the fact that we here on this podcast consistently talk about the fact we are in an election cycle already.
It kind of sums up how I feel. Let's talk about this utterly astonishing act of self-harm that we've seen unfold over the last few days. Do you know, it's really hard to know where to start, because I'm at a loss to understand the logic of someone thinking, I know, I'm going to phone up not just one paper, I'm going to phone up a whole load of newspapers, I'm going to phone a whole load of broadcasters and do such damaging briefing, and doing it this week so close to a difficult budget, when you had Rachel Reeves trying to sort of like lay the land for that the week before. And it has just made me furious that a small cohort in Downing Street have so little care and thought for party members and colleagues in Wales, not just here, but in Scotland, in parts of England who are facing elections next May, as they blithely, and I would say rather inexpertly too, bungle their way through, thinking they've got another 3 or 4 years to get things right before the next general election. It's hugely self-indulgent. It shows huge disrespect to party colleagues around the country. And frankly, it's just leaves people wondering why on earth would people not be willing to take a chance on Reform, the Greens, Plaid Cymru, whoever, given the almost constant chaos we're seeing. So we're just like we're punching ourselves in the face, frankly, and determined to prove that we're more concerned with political infighting than getting on and governing the country. And I heard Keir Starmer's remarks in Prime Minister's questions yesterday that he'd never authorised the attacks and that they were unacceptable, and I'm willing to take him at face value at that. But someone within Downing Street was briefing, and briefing hard. So I want to know what Keir Starmer's going to do about it now, frankly. And I'll end this rant very shortly, but I just want to say that I work for 2 First Ministers, and a huge generalisation here. But if I or another SPAD colleague had been briefing against members of their cabinet like that, I would have been sacked. Without question, I'd have been out the door. So I just think a bit of reflection is needed.
So this...
Sorry,
no, absolutely. I, with the promise with more to come. The interesting thing here is essentially people in and around number 10, first of all, given speculation over Keir Starmer's future following the May elections and also a difficult budget, wanted to make the point that Keir Starmer is up for the fight. He was going to, take on any challenges. But then the briefing sort of got even more out of hand and unbelievably radical, where it started. People started briefing against Wes Streeting, saying that he was running a shadow leadership campaign in the background. Meanwhile, Wes Streeting was getting ready to do the morning round of broadcasters the next morning and a big speech as well. And Craig, I mean, people might have gotten used to a bit of political infighting in the last few years, but I think it was
14 years, yeah.
Well, quite. But I think it was Andrew Bowie, who's the Shadow Scottish Secretary, who said, it at least took the Conservatives 13 years to get to this point. It is remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when I looked at the news and it was late the other evening, and essentially it was other people doing Keir Starmer's defence work for him, I thought, this is just weird. And I half expected to wake up the next morning, look at my phone and see that he had gone. It was that kind of drastic. I mean, the message it sends, irrespective of anything else, is that actually Keir Starmer is not in charge. I think we've seen this actually time and time again, and this just reiterates it. He hasn't done his own sort of defence work. He's not fighting to save his own job. He's either had colleagues go out and do it for him, or they thought they needed to do it for him because he can't do it himself. But actually, let's look back. At what point recently has he really taken leadership and made a decision as Prime Minister when it comes to matters of discipline? I can't think of any examples recently. The changes we've seen in Cabinet have all been made under duress after other people have resigned. There may have been discussions behind the scenes about what those resignations in inverted commas look like. However, we've seen Prime Ministers in the past make the point, the buck stops here, I am sacking whoever as Cabinet Secretary for whatever for this reason. We have not seen that happen. And so time and time again, it seems that actually things are happening around Keir Starmer and he isn't actually the one that's leading on them. And what I thought was most damning of all is in Prime Minister's questions the other day, I always think this is really telling, is when he said we're a united team and we're all working together or something like that, he just got laughed at. And I think, it's not the first time it's happened. Don't get me wrong. It's happened with Prime Ministers before, but at the point where a Prime Minister just openly gets laughed at in the chamber, that is a real problem. I think the only time I've seen a Prime Minister pretty much do like the Delia Smith, come on, let's be having you type approach was Boris Johnson. And you kind of expect that. We wouldn't see that from anyone else. And all he's done is and all his team has done is it's kind of widened the target on him now.
Well, also, I just kind of think, I mentioned, working for the First Ministers, and if any of the political appointees had done this, they'd have been out the door. But also, there are options. If you think someone is gearing up against you, have them in for a chat, go for a beer, just try and work out how much of a threat this is. Bring them into the tent even more if that's a tactic. The other tactic is you can sack them. If you think they're being that disloyal, sack them. But everything
But again, he hasn't
this,
done that. He hasn't sacked anyone, has he? Ever, as far as I'm aware.
Hasn't sacked anyone, but it was all just so politically inept as well. To think you can threaten and cajole and try to bring to heel elected members who have very valid concerns about what's going on at the moment, with the threat of turmoil in the bond markets. Come on, honestly. And I just think the absolute fury, did give me some heart is just how angry a lot of Labour MPs were. That, as I say, this Westminster bubble argument and fierce briefing, etc., without any thought to what's going on out in the country at the moment. And given all the things we've talked about, cost of living, people's unhappiness, if they think that this is helping, they're wrong. And the other irony, of course, that Wes Streeting, at the centre of all of that, deftly came out. I'm intrigued as to whether they deliberately did this before he was due to be on the, morning media round. But my goodness, he came out and he outperformed all of them, frankly. So the jokes about the traitors and conspiracy theories. So everything about this just feels to me to have backfired spectacularly.
It's interesting, isn't it? True. I know nothing about this from an internal perspective, so I'm going to presume either way. So whether Wes Streeting has been on manoeuvres or whether they've chosen Wes Streeting to make an example of, for want of a better phrase, either way, it brings into question the decision making of whoever has been involved in that. Because what's Wes Streeting in the middle of dealing with at the moment? A ballot for strike from the British Medical Association. And again, let's go back to that premise of how are things seen by the public? People are fighting about who should and could be in charge. 2 London MPs, while there are questions about the funding and the viability of the health service and who's going to be working, what operations are still going to be taking place. It's a weird one, though, as well. I must say, I'm old-fashioned, but my view is that you can't be leader of your party and prime minister with a 500 majority. And Wes has got a 520-something majority in Ilford at the moment. It's just bizarre, the whole thing. The whole thing just seems made up almost.
There's an interesting moment, Joe, in the lobby briefing to journalists after Prime Minister's questions yesterday, where basically all the journalists come out of the chamber afterwards and gets to speak to the Prime Minister's spokesperson, the Prime Minister's political spokesperson about what went on and other questions of the day. And the Prime Minister's political spokesperson was basically asked, well, what's he going to do about it? And Keir Starmer had said in the chamber he thinks those briefings are unacceptable. He didn't sanction them. He didn't think, and we were referred to those words. But one journalist sort of persisted and said, "Yeah, okay, so he thinks they're unacceptable. So what's he going to do about it? What does he do when he thinks things are unacceptable?" And we didn't really get an answer. And it wasn't until yesterday evening where Anna Turley, a Labour chair, sort of came on to a few programmes and said, I've spoken to the Prime Minister and he says he wants to get to the bottom of this and find out who did it. And now a lot of the cabinet are in revolt and saying particularly Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer's chief of staff, should go. But if you have a system whereby either Keir Starmer didn't sanction it and therefore he's not in charge of his number 10 political operation, or he did know about it and therefore looks politically inept because of it. Neither of those are good options. And then at the end of it says, it's unacceptable. What are you going to do about it? Well, there is no answer to that. If you're sat in Wales thinking about, okay, what are Labour offering me for the next election? If you're even sat in Eileen Ed Monaghan's office and you're thinking, oh, right, I'd love to make representations to the Chancellor and the Prime Minister about what I want from the budget coming up and what I want during our election campaign, it's hard to think you get a look in.
It's an absolute mess. And as I say, it's unnecessary. Why did you do it? And, I sat in weekly when the Senedd was sitting, FMQ briefing sessions the day before, the morning of, straight before, and you sort of, plan anything that's happened overnight, your response to it. He should have known that he was going to investigate who was behind it, if he didn't already know, or at least been honest if he said, I know and I'm going to sort it. The notion that it took the chair to come out later, there were loads of journalist questions yesterday afternoon as has Keir, since he says he didn't authorise those attacks, has he phoned Wes Streeting to say sorry? We're told then didn't happen to later on in the evening, and it was a very brief call, and they said they'd talk again. Honestly, where is your political judgment? And I think that if someone behind the scenes is causing enough trouble by unauthorised briefings, their position is just untenable going forward, because all of us who've worked in that very high-pressured environment, you know that you are working for the Prime Minister, for the First Minister. You don't freelance in those ways. Of course, we all get ourselves into trouble sometimes with off-the-cuff remarks, or, as a former journalist, I could sort of be lulled into that false sense of security sometimes and say something that I wish I hadn't. But, a couple of odd things you get away with. There is one name that is constantly being mentioned, and this isn't the first briefing against other members of the cabinet. I work a lot in the sort of creative industries culture sector. We all expected Lisa Nandy to not be there after the last reshuffle because the briefing against her had been ferocious. You got elected last year. For goodness sake, get on and govern and just stop this. It's really not acceptable, and it's really not acceptable when two of the nations of the UK are going to the polls next May.
You know
Is
what
that
it
angry
feels
enough
like?
for you? Sorry.
It doesn't feel that dissimilar, really, does it, to the Dominic Cummings situation? I mean, we've moved from one government having somebody behind the scenes going off-piste and doing what they want, and we've kind of just moved to another one, arguably. We know how long the Dominic Cummings situation took to resolve. I guess the question is, do we think that Keir Starmer's going to act more quickly than whoever acted in the end when it came to Dominic Cummings? Was it Boris Johnson? I can't remember in the end. Or did Dom go in the end? I don't know. But this is the point, I guess, isn't it? Is, again, from an outside looking in, the public look at this and go, who are these people? Who did we vote for? Morgan McWho? Who's he? Where was his name on a ballot paper?
Exactly. And the one thing I am absolutely sure of after fighting lots of election campaigns is the public don't vote for divided parties.
So someone said to me literally yesterday, they asked me, and I thought, this is bizarre that this conversation is even happening. Someone said to me, do I think that a Plaid Cymru-led government in Wales next year might be in a better position to negotiate with a Labour-led government in Westminster than the current situation we have? My immediate response was, well, of course not. But then the fact that that question is even being asked demonstrates the situation that we're in now, doesn't it?
Well, and it's a no, but yeah, I get it.
No, I know, but the fact that it's even but the fact that it's even being considered demonstrates quite where we are and where no one expected us to be. Let's be realistic.
And it plays into a story, particularly here in Wales, that is being told by Reform, and as we heard from Rhonab Iorwerth last week, is being told by Plaid Cymru, which is, the question on the ballot paper in May is not necessarily, your party loyalty or have you been satisfied with X, Y, Z. Do you think there might be a different way of running Wales? Yes or no? And that's the referendum that they're going to try and put on that ballot paper. And if you are looking at Labour's operation in Westminster, voters are going to be inclined to think, well, I don't need a load of that, really. And how are we supposed to get a look in if they're all fighting each other? How is anyone sat in Cardiff Bay, whether it's a Plaid Cymru politician who is just going to have their back turned anyway, or whether it's a Labour politician who's going to have a back turned on them because they're busy infighting? Does it make that much of a difference? So
also, it just takes away from other stuff that's going on, sort of, decent stuff. We're talking about this. We're not talking about the new nuclear investment in North Wales. As you say, Wes Streeting getting on and trying to solve a potential strike. You just kind of think, put it aside, please.
Definitely. Well, there we go. I think that was enough fire and fury for 1 week. We will. Well, Jo will cross her fingers that this all gets wrapped up and sorted by next week's episode. But we will find out whether that's the case and whether Morgan McSweeney or anyone else is still in a job by next week.
Get this out quick. Get this episode out quick. Come on.
Exactly. Thank you, Jo, and thank you you, Craig, as ever. And do press subscribe on your podcast app. Thank you for listening. You can find us to watch on YouTube as well. And we will drop into your feeds every week with the latest on Welsh politics and policy making. You will not miss a thing here on Senedd Sources. Thanks to you for listening, and we'll talk with you again next week.